Hello. If you've ever read a game book like Fighting Fantasy or Lone Wolf, then you'll have some sense of how complex they are to write. How do you take 400 separate sections and link them together in multiple ways that make any kind of sense? My guest today is one of the most experienced writers in the gamebook industry, having worked on 8 Fighting Fantasy books, written the definitive history of the series, and created his own range of ace gamebooks that reimagine classic stories like Dracula and Alice in Wonderland as choose-your-own-path adventures. And somewhere in the midst of all that, he has written several stories for the Black Library, set in the worlds of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Jonathan Green. John, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you finding some time. I thought we'd start by just talking a bit about your career in general and how you came to be writing books and game books, sort of what got you started in the industry, I suppose.
Okay. I've always written books for as long as I can remember, or certainly as long as I knew that books were a thing that people wrote, if that makes sense. So age 6, I was folding up bits of paper and stapling them together. There wasn't much writing involved, but there was the whole process of creating a book and characters. And I had a character called Stubby Pencil, which I still think could probably go somewhere, and all his sort of pencil case friends. But it was when I first saw The Wall of Far Top Mountain and read that, the first Fighting Fantasy game book, that I think I really thought, this is something I want to write. And I started writing my own pastiches and, in notebooks and things and illustrating myself, and they wouldn't really go anywhere. But I didn't stop doing it. So when a lot of my friends moved on to other interests, I still kept going. And I remember once I wrote one that was 200 sections long, and I thought, brilliant, this is awesome. But I didn't write one that was 400 until I was actually commissioned by Puffin. But by that point, I'd finished school. So I wrote to Puffin Books saying I'd like to write a game book. And of course, they could have just ignored it. But I, in time, got a letter back from Mark Gascoigne, who was the consultant editor at Fighting Fantasy at the time. He's currently the publisher at Aconite Books. And I've obviously known Mark for a long time now. And we've been involved in projects together on and off over the years. But yeah, he wrote back explaining what we had to do. And it was, you wrote the first 100 sections of a 400 section book. You had the complete plot for the rest of the book. So you couldn't say, and if you want to know what happens, you have to buy the book, which drives editors and publishers mad. You had to describe any new rules, any particular new monsters. And obviously, I think he finished the letter by saying, your chance of getting published are very slim. Because I think at the time they were having about 5 just unsolicited submissions a week going in. So in my summer holidays after finishing school, I sat down and started to write my first proposal, which is a book called Outlaws of Kharn. And Kharn isn't on the map. It was my misreading of a spelling on the map. It's meant to be card, K-A-A-D, rather than K-A-A-N. But it was a very generic, you wander through a wood, you fight bandits. The big bad at the end was going to ride a nightmare, as it's called in Fighting Fantasy. So basically like a black stallion Pegasus, I suppose. And it was, roundly rejected. But Mark gave me some very positive feedback, and I went away and I had a second go at writing the same idea. And although he liked some elements of it, one including being a highwayman called Lord Filthy Lucre, he said, I praised that enough. This idea isn't really going anywhere. So I then scrapped it. And at the end of my first year at uni, I started with a completely different idea. And that one, sometimes I thought this is much better, and other times I thought this is just rubbish. But a year later, I think it was, I have to get this right now, the timing of it, end of my second year at university anyway, I'd rewritten the thing twice. I think actually no, 3 times, because by that point, Mark had passed it on to the editor at Puff, and he said, no, this has got legs. Had to make some more changes. But in 1992, I was commissioned to write my first Fighting Fantasy game book. So that was my summer holiday job. Like I said, it was the first time I'd written one that was actually a proper length. Looking back now, there's lots that's very flawed about the book, and people have quite rightly pointed that out. Part of the problem is that by that point, I still played the books. but I cheated. I didn't bother to do any of the battles. So I tried to write the book to beat people like me. Now, being a bit older and possibly a bit wiser, I realize that if somebody wants to cheat, it's probably because they're enjoying the story. And it's honestly up to them. But you should write it for the person who wants to play fairly. But other people over the years, they've said lots of very nice things about it. One of which is that they actually like the writing and the storytelling. It was the game element which was done maybe not as well as it might have been. So, but having written that first book for Puffin, I was then kind of part of the stable of authors, and it worked out that until Puffin stopped publishing them, I was one of the. I wrote one for each year for 3 years, so there were kind of 3 slots in the year, and I was writing one of them. The first time Spellbreaker was published, that was at the end of my 3rd year at uni, and I went into town to go to W.H. Smith's, and I saw it in a bookshelf, and ridiculously, I was reading my own book and looking at it in the bookshop, and as a result, I got a parking ticket. But yeah, so that sticks in the memory. But yeah, so I then, like I say, carried on until Puffin stopped publishing them, which was the last one came out in 1995. But I'd written by that point my 4th adventure, which was Bloodbones, and it never saw print until Wizard Books took over, and Steve Jackson got in touch saying, we'd like to publish this missing game book. So the introduction to Bloodbones talks about it all began 10 years ago. And that's about the history of the character in the book. And it was actually 10 years from when I'd written it to when it was finally published. So it's just a nice happy accident.
Yeah, that's great.
But yeah, so having written for Puffin, I was doing a teacher training course at university. And during my final teaching practice, I was put off teaching because there were lots of middle-aged people in the staff room, and all they did all day was, or when they were in the staff room, was whinge. And I thought, I don't want this to be me. And I want to write. I've always wanted to be creative. It was kind of like, you'll never make a living as a writer, so you need to have another job. So, well, I'll train to be a teacher. So I didn't apply for any teaching jobs when I left university. All my friends, during our finals, they were going off for interviews, and I wasn't bothering at all because I was going to go off and be a writer, which I did. So when I left uni, I didn't go home because I thought, I've got to prove I can do this. But by that point, I'd actually been up to Nottingham and met Mark Gascoigne, and he knew Jervis Johnson at Games Workshop. And Jervis didn't enjoy writing the fiction sections in what were then the Warhammer Army books and the 40k codexes. So Mark suggested me. I think I'd moved to Nottingham before I actually met Jervis, but it's one of the few times I've been taken out for a working lunch. Jervis bought me a burger down the pub, and we discussed what he wanted. But yeah, so I moved to Nottingham from university, was renting a flat there. And in November of, this must be 94, I had my first paid work for Games Workshop, which was writing they call it colour text, but the short stories that were in the Dark Elves Army book. And in those sort of pieces of text, you're always having to big up the character or the army that the book's about. So obviously the Dark Elves won in all the battles. And some of them, there was one scene I wrote about, which was a bit of politicking in the Dark Elf court, which didn't make it into the book, but was published later in one of the Games Days programs. So it does exist out there. I've forgotten which one it was now, but it is out there. So yeah, having done one for them, I then started doing the odd codex. So I did Codex Chaos. I'm trying to think if this was 2nd edition, but it's the one, I think it's Abaddon on the front, and it's all sort of gold and black and that sort of style, the very lurid period of artwork. Yeah, so I did Codex Chaos, I did Codex Angels of Death, and I wrote the background for the Dark Elves for that. Sorry, I wrote the background for the Dark Angels for Jervis, but under Jervis's instruction. So I'm pretty sure that Jervis must have told me this, but that's why it mentioned that the lion was still inside the rock and his wounds were slowly healing, or he was still hidden away in this chamber. Because I know that upset some people that there's this Primarch and he's actually in the background. And of course, now he's properly in the game. But yes, it's good fun doing that. And I did, Tyranids as well. I wrote color text for Epic 40k. I did, the Dark Elves. I'm trying to think which other, Wood Elves was the other one I did. So, and while I was doing that for Games Workshop, I ended up doing supply teaching. So I moved from Nottingham to London to become a teacher. So I did did my dues. I did about 15 years teaching, maybe a bit more actually now on and off, I forget. But there's always been the writing in the background, and I've done periods of part-time teaching work and part-time writing and full-time writing and full-time writing plus a full-time teaching job, which was quite hard at one point.
Right.
But yeah, so I remember it was when they had the offices under Nottingham Castle. I've now completely forgotten the name of the boulevard it was on, but they were based there for a while.
Boulevard, yeah.
There we go. And that's why I think it's Castle Rock, is one of the places in Necromunda. It's certainly referenced in one of the games.
Sure, I think it turns up in a few places for sure.
Yeah. So where it was underneath, because you had sort of Nottingham Castle, which wasn't what I expected at all, because I'd watched Robin Hood show it. It didn't look like Alnwick Castle in Northumberland at all. It's some kind of Georgian or Regencies or period, just rectangular block.
Yeah.
But underneath the rock, there's all the tunnels, which for a while you could certainly visit when you're Nottingham. And then you went down onto the road, and it was just in this, didn't look anything special, kind of office building, just this little buzzer at the door, and you go in. But then once you were let in from reception, you went into this huge, I think it was mezzanine levels and sort of two sort of split floor design studio, which was awesome. So I'd pop in there from time to time to discuss projects with Jervis and Andy Chambers. And I met Gav Thorpe there, because I think when I started working freelance, I think he'd just been employed as a trainee game designer. So he was working on Warhammer Quest with Andy Jones. I remember that, certainly. But also, Andy Jones was sort of minister without portfolio. While I was in Nottingham, he was setting up Black Library. So I do remember one day being there for a discussion. I don't think I was involved particularly, but I just happened to be there. A discussion about Inferno, the magazine, and what format it was going to be. And some people apparently wanted it to be the same size as the army books, but others wanted it to be smaller, so it looked different. And obviously it ended up being smaller. But at the time, it wasn't called Inferno. I think it was going to be called Rampage. So it got a name change as well. But because of all that, it meant that when it was eventually published, I'd written the short story that appeared in issue 0 that went out in White Dwarf magazine. That was a Warhammer story called The Hounds of Winter. And then I wrote Salvation, which was my first 40k short story for Inferno about Ultramarines. And it's been reprinted in various books, and people have always been very, very nice about it. But it was written involving a Carnifex, I think, but one of the old school ones where it was just kind of that blob with a couple of claws coming out either side of its body. Nothing like the amazing models they are now. Although they've now brought back the Screamer Killer, haven't they? Which I think is what the Carnifex was nicknamed at the time anyway.
Yeah.
So I was involved but by that point I then moved to London, but I started doing regular short story submissions to Inferno. I wrote the occasional magazine article for White Dwarf. As I discovered, I think they were leading up to a new edition of Warhammer. So the fact that I was writing these Warhammer articles was quite good, because it gave them new material for the magazine whilst they could focus on the new edition. But I wrote one called Holding Out for a Hero. Enter the Dragon was another. And then some of my ideas didn't get used and appeared in Citadel Journal. So there was one a sort of battle campaign with the Skaven, and I don't remember much about it apart from there was a tank which somebody then made a model of, so it looked like a piece of cheese. But that wasn't me who made the model, but that was printed in, and I think you could get it online at one point as well. For a while they had it available. But having done various short stories, Warhammer 40k, Necromunda, I wrote a character called Nathan Creed, who I was particularly fond of. But from that, I was then invited to submit a novel. I wanted to write a Nathan Creed one. I remember that. I think I must have probably pitched that first. And I had that it involved Gene Stealers in Hive Primus. And they're like, oh no, we're saving the Gene Stealers for Hive Secundus, which again, I think is something that is now in the Necromunda game. Or
you certainly hear.
To be honest, I forget.
Yeah. I mean, they've sort of toyed with a lot of those ideas and expanded on a lot of that stuff around Necromunda, and Secundus is now, much more part of the lore. Yeah,
it's amazing all the Ashway stuff they've done. But so I ended up writing a Warhammer Fantasy novel. Well, I say novel because I'd written a character called Torben Badenoff, and the only reason he's called that, I don't know where I got the name Torben from, but there was Boris Godunov, so I thought, well, I'll have Torben Badenoff because he's from Kislev. So it was his band of mercenaries, and they'd been in, I think, three or four short stories by the time I was commissioned to write the novel. And it was suggested to me that, what we could do, because other people had done it. I think Dan Abnett, Hammers of Auric, has got Dan's, I forgot what they're called now, the Middenheim Wolf guys with the Wolf Knights and their short stories, plus James Wallace's Priest of Moor kind of murder mysteries. And then I think Dan then sort of finished off the story, bringing them together. So I did the similar thing. So it reprinted the short stories that had already been out there, and then I wrote new short stories to carry it on. And I remember the book got, this was my first novel, so I was very excited about it, but it got reviewed in SFX magazine. So I thought, yes, I've arrived. And it got 1 star. And I was like, oh, so, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But I don't think I've had a review that bad published since. I think they're all kind of 3 stars and above. And in my head, it thinks, well, if you've got 3 stars, it means you can write. They might not like what you've written about, and it might not be the style of writing. It might be a bit simplistic, possibly, or not very deep, very layered. But if you're getting 3 and above, that's okay. So, and I think one of his criticisms was, this isn't a novel, it's a short story collection. It's like, yeah, that's true. I can't argue that.
Right.
But again, because at the time there weren't, I couldn't tell you how many people are writing Black Library now, but I think we're probably a slightly smaller pool. And it was then the expectation you sort of do 2 novels a year. So I got onto a bit of a treadmill, and I was alternating doing Warhammer and 40k. So my second novel was meant to be another Torben Badenoff novel. And then I think it was Lindsay Priestley, my editor, said, or might have been Mark Gascoigne, I'm not sure, because Mark was working. He was running the Black Library at that point as well. Anyway, somebody wanted a Black Templars novel and gave me some ideas. So I wrote Crusade for Armageddon. And that was going to become a trilogy. And I wrote the second one, which is Conquest of Armageddon. And then I can't remember what the third one was going to be called, but that never happened. Because somebody asked me to write an Iron Hands novel, again, which is possibly not my best work, but it's still available as an ebook and people still buy it, which is nice. And although I know people have written much better Iron Hand novels since, the fact that it says Iron Hands as the title doesn't hurt, I think, when people search on the Black Library website. But the other novels I wrote were Magestorm in the end. So I never wrote another Torben Badenoff short story. So I did write a short story, which did get reprinted. It was The Mark of the Beast. That was reprinted in, I think it was Swords of the Empire or one of them, I've forgotten now. But I never wrote another novel with those characters. But I wrote Magestorm, which was then tied into the Storm of Chaos campaign and the Warcry card game. And then I wrote Necromancer, which was again meant to be the start in a series, but ended up just being the only one.
Sure. I mean, and these, it's interesting because obviously you're working in this sort of shared world. As you mentioned about some of the color text for the Warhammer Armies books, that was kind of directed by Jervis. But when it comes to short stories or the longer stories, did you just have free reign to do whatever you wanted, or were you kind of given a couple of bullet points, especially for something like the Storm of Chaos and the sort of Magestorm book? Did you have
the
to
Storm of
hit
Chaos was,
stuff?
I mean, generally, as I remember it, you had free reign, but I submitted a lot of ideas. I had a lot rejected. I kind of was a bit of an ideas machine, but I think it was Mark who said to me once, because some people say, where do you get your ideas from? He's saying, people have ideas every day. It's having a good idea, and it's realizing which is the good idea. I may be paraphrasing, I may have got this wrong. So, but it was certainly I'm pretty sure it was Mark who said it to me. It was good advice. And I possibly sometimes a bit scattergun throughout all these ideas and possibly should have thought about them a bit longer and slept on it a bit more. But I was so keen just to keep writing. But with something like the Storm of Chaos, that was definitely guided because they said, you were going to do another Torben Badenoff, but we'd like a novel that ties into this. So I think Dan had already written Riders of the Dead. And I think somehow they tied that in as well. But certainly it's terrible, I do apologize, but I've written 80 books now. Well, I had 80 books published. So I do forget details because I've moved on.
Understandable.
But I was asked to include some of the characters from the Warcry card game. I think I was given free reign in that, but they gave me a selection, and I chose Gerhard Brennan, who was the fire wizard from the Fire College of Magic. And there was also a Chaos Sorcerer, and I think the Chaos Sorcerer had appeared, or there was something happened. I somehow managed to tie an event from Dan's book into mine. I know that, like an enchanted skull. And Gav Thorpe, I think, was running I think he might have been Warhammer Lawmaster at the time and sort of come up with the Storm of Chaos idea anyway. And one of the things that I put in it was how the chaos cannon was created, the ritual that they went through to have it possessed by a demon. Um, so because it became official, Gav very kindly, I get a note of thanks in the Storm of Chaos book, which is very nice of him. So yeah, that one, I think it was like, this is what we'd like it to tie into. Here are some bullet points, here are some characters. And then it was up to me to sort of put it all together and for them to approve. So it was an unusual one. Also partly because it had an almost white cover apart from Adrian Smith's artwork, which was the Fire Wizard from the Warcry set. And I actually I now own the original artwork and it's on my office wall just over there, which is rather cool because Adrian Smith's an amazing artist.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean that's so because then you didn't just do the sort of traditional fiction for Games Workshop and Black Library either, did you? You also brought some of that game book knowledge into the 40K and the Warhammer Fantasy world as well, and their Paths to Victory series, that sort of relatively short-lived series of books.
I did. The history of Warhammer game books goes back quite a way because when I first moved to Nottingham, I ended up lodging with Mark Gascoigne. So he's been my co-writer, my editor, my publisher, and my landlord over the years. But we pitched an idea, I think it was to Box Tree, because it was before Black Library was set up, for a series of Warhammer game books. I don't think 40K was involved at that point. But then nothing came of that. And then when I was teaching in London, around 2005, 2006, 7, something like that, Black Library were considering doing it. I wrote some pitches for them then, kind of taking a different character each time. I remember I wrote a pitch for Witch Hunter, and again, nothing came of it then either. And it was several years later, and at a time when actually I was writing full time, Christian Dunn was working for Black Library. I think having started off the Black Library, he'd gone off to Solaris, and I think this is the time when Solaris had been sold to Rebellion. So Christian came back to commissioning Black Library stuff. He was involved quite heavily, I think, with the audio dramas and things like that. But it became his project, and he was a Fighting Fantasy fan from back in the day. So he got in touch with me, and he said he was writing one. He'd got Richard Ford, I think, writing one under a pen name, The Beneath the City of the White Wolf, and asked me to pitch. So I pitched for a Space Marine book. I can't remember how much guidance I had. I think it was one they wanted like various different alien races involved. So I don't know again whether it was my idea or their idea, but it's based on a space hole. So you've got obviously all those alien ships that have sort of this massive conglomeration in the warp. So it gave you the excuse to have a Tyranid bio ship as well as a Necron tomb ship, and I had orcs and Dark Eldar in it as well. And that was Herald of Oblivion. And it was, I know I had to make it an Imperial Fist, who was the main character. And then again, that was supposed to be a trilogy. But then before I could get onto that, they wanted another Warhammer one. And for that, I pitched Shadows over Sylvania, because for some reason, the titles of the Warhammer books were all going to have a preposition in there somewhere. So you had Beneath the City of the White Wolf, Shadows over Sylvania. And I actually wrote a full pitch for a third one, again, which didn't go anywhere, which was Across the Desert of the Dead. So it would have been Bretonnian Knights to Nehekara. And, look what's happened there. What are the chances? No. So yeah, I wrote that one. I really enjoyed writing, and I think that it's probably one of which I'm still most proud, although not many people have read it. But I set it again, I think it was at the time 200 years ago in Warhammer's past, but it was the new at the time Vampire Counts book had come out, and so I pored over the map of Sylvania and tried to include everything I could possibly want. And I know that by setting it in the past, there were bits. I think now I think about it, it might have been set at the time of the Three Emperors, which is obviously the current old world setting. But again, I don't remember. I've got the book here. I could actually read it. So I know there'll be people looking at this jealously because these are various hens online. And
I am one of them. Yeah, very tough to find a copy of that.
So I'll put that away. That's my copy. But yeah, so things like, I think they're meant to be in certain castles, like one was a watchtower been built, so I had the construction of it going on in the book. But that was fun because you were right. In the book, you play a vampire, and you could be different types. You could be a blood knight, Alarmy, and von Karstein. I think that was it. I think we just had the three. But it meant that because of the setup, again, it was meant to be after the death, I think it was of like von Karstein. So there's kind of a power vacuum in Sylvania. So the different sides are fighting to gain power, and you're a minor vampire trying to bring this about for your leader. So it meant I could have you fighting other undead, as well as other things. So there are Skaven in the book, there are goblins, there's chaos. You get to fight the Empire. So it was a lot of fun, and it's a bit of a gazetteer, sort of wander all over the place. So quite sandboxy. But I won't spoil the twist in case people are hoping to read it or get a copy one day. But yeah, with the game books for Black Library, I didn't do any of the rules. So the rules set, because they're a games company, that was done by them. So I was writing the content. So I'd say, this is a bit where you fight this creature, and then in this version it's going to be the same creature, but it'll be slightly weaker because this has happened, and they do all the stats. So I didn't actually see those until it was in print. Whereas with the Fighting Fantasy, I did the stats myself, but like I said, possibly with those early ones, I wasn't as balanced in my game design as I could have been. But yeah, I mean, I also wrote comic strips for the Black Library. Haven't done much comic work since, but randomly one of my weirdest gigs was I did write Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics for Russia. So I've never seen them in Russian, but it meant that you couldn't have any puns because it wouldn't translate. So you can have visual gags and things like that. So I had one bit where they go up against some mutant turtles, and they're all based, because they're all Renaissance painters. I think all the ones they had to fight were either Impressionist painters or pre-Raphaelites or something like that. Some terrible pun. And they often involved pizza, but I realize that's nothing to do with Games Workshop. But yeah, so Games Workshop, I didn't write any ongoing series, but I wrote things like Tales from the 10-Tailed Cat. I did the Miner's Tale, which is about a dwarf. I did the Tale of the Hound, which was based on a Welsh legend about the dog that protects its master's baby from the wolves, and they think the dog's killed the baby. And in the end, is it Gellert, something like that?
Yeah,
the dog.
Beth Gellert.
But of course, being Warhammer, mine has a much darker ending. The Farmer's Tale, which was a kind of pastiche of Farmer Giles of Ham. Yeah, that was very cool because, again, you got to work with some amazing artists. So people who I read in 2000 AD. I mean, Steve Yowell illustrated The Tale of the Hound, which was just amazing. I was blown away by that. Oh, and I got to write a Mordheim comic strip because they did, it was either issue 63 or 64, they did Warped Visions. So characters who'd appeared in 40k strips appeared as Warhammer characters and vice versa. So I think Dan Abnett wrote a Darkblade book where Darkblade was a female Dark Eldar rather than a male Dark Elf. And I wrote Ephrael Stern as Ephrael von Stern, and Inquisitor Hand became Witch Hunter Hand, exploring Mordheim. So yeah, that was good fun. And also that ended up being the strip that was used on the cover. So it had Patrick Goddard full painted cover. So that was awesome. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that's terrific stuff. I mean, so, and is there, it sounds like there were a lot of projects that sort of ideas that didn't quite come to fruition and sort of things that didn't quite make it. Was there any of besides the ones you've mentioned, were there any that you were like really precious about that you would have loved to have got the chance to write that just never, they didn't get past that early stage?
Yeah, I wrote, I don't know how many pitches for novels. I mean, the short stories loads, but the pitches for novels, I'd worked up at least a rough outline of the second Badenoff's band story, because the first one was called The Dead and the Damned, and I was then going to become, I think in my own head, it's going to be the something else and the damned each time. And I thought it was a nice idea for that, but I don't think I ever actually pitched that one. I can't remember. I did have various ones turned down, but one I would love to have written, but again, I don't think it ever got to the pitching point, was I would love to have written and carried on the Necromancer story, because Necromancer is one of the novels that I was really pleased with. It was what I hoped it would be, and I wanted to carry on his story because it starts off, the premise is what would make an ostensibly good person choose to become a necromancer. So the novel's bookended with this old necromancer. Effectively, he ends up at a monastery and he's dying. It's his confession, so he goes back to his youth, and it was all set in Bergenhafen. And I had the map from Shadows. Was it Shadows over Bergenhafen?
Oh yeah.
But everywhere in the book is described. You can follow it on the map that they go. Um, and it gets to a certain point in the story where he's effectively using necromantic magic for the first time. But then it jumps back to this old guy's confession for the twist in the tale. But I would like to carry on the story, and I plotted out the second novel in detail, and it had slowly his sort of mind breaking down, and his beloved who died in the first book. One of the reasons that he became a necromancer, he ended up working sort of for a priest of Moor and tending, and one of the statues in the graveyard he started to imagine was his dead girlfriend talking to him. So I thought, well, there's like psychological side. It wasn't actually, but was quite fun. And I would like, and then people realizing who he is and him trying to sort of cover his tracks to protect himself. I would like to have done that. And I think I had several books plotted out for that one in my head anyway.
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
great. That sounds really interesting. Yeah. Was it just one of these things that just didn't come together when it came to it?
Again, I don't remember from Black Library side, but I made the conscious decision to stop writing for the Black Library at that point. I don't think I've ever discussed this with anybody, which may seem like madness. And I did work for the Black Library after that, but um, I'd basically given up teaching to be a writer. And at that time, I felt people were buying my books because they were Warhammer books. They weren't buying them because they were Jonathan Green books. And if I was going to make my writing career a serious thing where I could make a proper living out of it, I had to change that. Maybe if I'd stayed, I might have ended up being with those first authors who got, first hardbacks at Black Library. I mean, obviously, it depends on whether you're any good or not as well. And I would never claim to be Dan Abnett or Bill King or anybody like that. They might be the authors I aspire to be, but I'm not them. So at the time as well, when I'd given up teaching, I'd written the first Pax Britannia novel for Abaddon Books, who are owned by Rebellion, who owned 2000 AD. And that I saw an advert somewhere saying, we're looking for authors for these 4 novel lines. And they had one which was basically zombies. And I think it wasn't one continuity, but all the stories had zombies. So somebody ended up doing like The Viking Dead, and I forgot what they were called, but other things like that. There was the generic sort of fantasy one. There was, I think, some sort of science fiction, but I don't remember much about that one. And there was going to be a sort of a First World War. The Tommies are going over the top, and mist descends, and then end up on an alien planet. And that series did end up getting written by Pat Kelleher. But I wrote to them saying, I've written for Black Library, I've written for Fighting Fantasy. So by that point, I must have written 5 or 6 novels for Black Library. So I could say, I can finish a book. I'd be happy writing for any of these series, or here's an idea for a steampunk series. And I wrote about 2 paragraphs of background, pretty much made it up on the spur of the moment, or it must have been percolating in my mind. And nothing got changed from that I think even the name of the character I came up with, I thought would be a temporary name, and it stuck. So it was Ulysses Quicksilver. And that became the Pax Britannia series. And they published 11 Pax Britannia novels, 8 of mine, 3 by Al Ewing. David Moore, the editor, wrote a Pax Britannia ebook. I did various novellas and short stories for that as well. And I've written a few since the novels came to an end as well. But yes, in my mind, this was a way to kind of take the next step. And possibly the Black Library deal would have been a more lucrative one, but it certainly helped push my name as a new thing. And at the same time, I then started pitching to other people, because I remember seeing a series of Doctor Who Decide Your Destiny game books. And in my own mind thinking, these aren't the best, so choose an adventure, which for me was always far inferior to Fighting Fantasy or Lone Wolf. And then I thought, stop being such a arrogant snob. Why don't you pitch for one? So I wrote to Puffin Books, who published them, and it just happened that I had one of those editors who's open to new submissions. She was great, Leanne Gill. I think she's now in charge at Ladybird Books. But she said, yeah, we're looking to publish another half dozen or whatever it was of these. You're welcome to pitch some ideas. I think I pitched 4 ideas, 2 of which were rejected. And then partly because one clashed with something they were developing for the show, because Cardiff had to approve everything, and 2 others. And it's basically, which one do we want you to do? And they picked one. And later on, I ended up writing another Doctor Who game book, and I got to develop the second idea, which wasn't used. So that was nice. Yes, and then I kind of got on the books there, and I ended up writing a Star Wars game book, and I did all sorts of science fiction for a range called Moshi Monsters, which if people are my age and they've got kids in their like late teens who are about 5 or 6, who are into Moshi Monsters. Another one of the weird jobs, I wrote the novelization of the Moshi Monster movie. That was an interesting experience. One of my books had a launch and a signing at Harrods, but I wasn't there because it was Mr. Moshi. So he was signing his book, and I was one of a series of authors who'd written the book. Yeah, so some funny gigs, but some good experiences over the years.
How do you find that sort of, because obviously you must have to put yourself into a very different sort of mindset and kind of a perspective that you need to take on when you're writing a, say, Star Wars book versus a Doctor Who book versus a Moshi Monsters book. Are there any sort of like tips and tricks and sort of like how do you go about that process?
Well, I keep quoting Mark Gascon, I've realised now, but he's definitely said before, when you write for any tie-in fiction, any IP, there's only 2 rules. One is you have to be true to the IP, and the other is to be any good. So you don't just have to, people who write and are published, I know there are lots of people will be desperately hoping to be published one day, and I wish them all the very best. But there's an element where once you are published, an editor or publisher might be looking for somebody who can hit a deadline. It might not be the best book, but it won't be, I've now got to go and think about this for a year and really ponder on this, spend a week on this chapter. It'll be like, well, can you get this to us to by the end of March? So there's an element of, it's a job, you sit down, you might not turn out the best book, but you can turn out a good book in the time. But yeah, it's being true to the IPs, it's you're immersing yourself in that. So when I was first writing for Games Workshop, for a while, I ended up getting pretty much every boxed game that they produced. I mean, they filled up the cupboard in my flat. And in the end, I sold them all when I became a dad and we needed the money. But yeah, some of them I think people must have gotten for a steal, but I had like complete books, none of the miniatures painted at Battlefleet Gothic. I had Necromunda, probably more than one edition of Warhammer. Yeah, all sorts of things. But yeah, so whenever I got set, and I'd read the background books, I'd buy army books. I still got shelves of Warhammer army books over there, immerse myself in the lore. And it's the same with anything else. And obviously, sometimes researching that lore might be more interesting than others. I mean, Moshi Monsters, it wasn't aimed at, 30-something middle-aged men at the time. But, you have to be true to it and also true to the tone of it. The funny thing with that is I did write a 12th Doctor, so Peter Capaldi Incarnation game book. And when I was pitching it, they wanted to bring back the Doctor Who game books. And they said, would you write the first one? Peter Capaldi's going to be the Doctor, but nothing had been on TV. I think I was allowed to go and read a script if I wanted to, but it had to be in the office. And it was very, you couldn't take photos. I didn't do that because I had been offered that for the first one. It didn't happen. So I wrote my sample based on Malcolm Tucker from The Thick of It and took the swearing out. And the funniest thing is when the editor got back and said, yeah, you've got the Doctor's character spot on. So, yeah, that was interesting. but yeah, it's research. It's doing your homework. At the moment, I'm researching another setting that I'm not familiar with in any detail for a potential project. The last book I finished and sent off to my publisher, I can talk about because it's been announced, is my first Arkham Horror game book. And although I knew a bit more about that setting, again, they sent me the world Bibles and the character, the investigator background. So a lot of research. And for something like that, to do the first book probably takes me longer than it would for some projects because, like you say, I'm having to make sure I get the tone right, the characters right. What I'm waiting on now, it's been approved by my editor, but the license holder has to give it the once over as well and make sure it fits with their view of their vision of things. But with that, it took quite a long time to get the pitch accepted, so a lot of toing and froing. So hopefully most of those problems were ironed out at that stage. Fingers crossed. Yeah, so that in a nutshell, it's do your homework and then write a good book.
Sure, yeah. And then I'm guessing there's a distinction in the writing of a game book versus writing a sort of more traditional book, a more traditional novel. I mean, what does that feel like? What's the sort of difference between writing in those two styles?
Well, lots of my friends were novelists, so I don't know how you can possibly write a game book. That'd be so hard. And I've written both. And for me, I find it easier to write game books than novels. I used to think, in novels, it's because you have to develop characters and have character arcs and all sorts of things moving on like that. Because the received wisdom used to be that you can't have character development in a game book because the character is the reader. And I've now realized that's nonsense. You can absolutely have character development, and you can still have the reader making the choices. So that doesn't really apply. But I think part of it is, when I've never written by the seat of my pants. I think because I always wrote Fighting Fantasy game books, my very first proposal, I had to outline the whole thing. That's how I always work. Even when I've written something for myself that I've not had to show to anybody else, I will still work out the outline before I start writing. Maybe not in as much detail. But I think part of it is you break down the game book into so many different scenes. So, it could be, I've written game books that are longer than novels now, some of the novels I've written. But part of it is when you outline the novel, you're breaking down the chapters, and these are the different, sort of the narrative flow. You've got the highs and the lows and the building up to the climax and all the rest of it, and character stories and how they all link in. And when you do the game book, you're effectively doing the same thing, but because you have to write every single option, I break it down into scenes. So as you might have, say, 20 chapters in a book, I would have 20 scenes, and then I break down each scene. So I suppose in a way, the way I plan a game book and the way I plan a novel are similar. The nice thing about the game book is when I'm writing a novel, I have to decide, well, this happens or this happens. In the game book, you can have both happen. That's the choices and the outcome. But yeah, it does involve a lot of flow charting. When I started out, I would sort of, with things like Spellbreaker, I think I sort of did the flow chart, made up the map as I went along, whereas now I will flow chart it before I start writing. I'm much more disciplined. And it might change in the editing or in the writing or editing process. But at least I have an outline of where I want it to go. And it partly helps me hit certain beats in the story, keep within a certain number of sections. There's all sorts of things it helps me with. And it helps editors as well later because, they can check whether things link up, or if they're stuck as they're trying to play it, where should I have gone? What should it do? Yeah.
Yeah. I've often wondered if there's, because obviously not every game book has multiple routes through it. Some are sort of more, they'll obviously choices, but they tend to lead you back to certain routes to get to the conclusion. What's sort of your preference in that? Do you like to have completely different narratives and routes that could get you to the conclusion, or is it sort of a bit of both? How do you tackle that?
I guess you've got the two extremes. At one end, you've got Choose Your Own Adventure, which is a branching narrative where literally it's like a tree diagram going down and down and down. Nothing links up. It's just, A, B, or C. You go this way, that way, that this happens, this happens, this happens. One of the things that used to frustrate me about Choose Your Own Adventure is the actual story you read is really short, which I think is partly why they were such a success and would have certainly have helped children read because they weren't put off by this idea, I've got to read the whole book, and you're jumping in backwards and forwards. But I prefer, although you get to make the decisions, you don't really have that much agency because all you're doing is, well, now I'm going to read what the author decided would happen if this happens. There's maybe not a particular logical pattern. I do remember some adventures had the most random things happen. I think the Abominable Snowman was one of the first ones, but there's all sorts of different things that can happen. And I found that unsatisfying. Whereas with a game book, something like Fighting Fantasy or Lone Wolf, you've got a puzzle to solve. It's effectively, the writer like Steve Jackson or Ian Livingstone or Joe Deaver, they're the crossword setter, and you're then trying to crack the code to complete it. But within that structure, you can still have quite a linear story. And some I've written have been more linear than others, partly when I've done my Ace game books, which are based on existing stories. Sometimes that's meant there's been an element of linearity within it. But I would prefer to have something that's less linear, but that there's not one true path anymore. Because Fighting Fantasy used to be sold on the premise, there's one true path, can you find it through to the end? I now like to have different options, which maybe play to different strengths. And certainly in the Marvel game book I've written, Moon Knight has 3 different characteristics. He's got might, mystic, and mind. And depending on the choices you make, those stats can go up and down. And there are ways to complete the adventure with each of those being the more powerful stat. You obviously have to make the right choices and follow the clues to make sure that happens. But that would be my preferred method of writing. And I certainly did that with my adaptation of Dracula, but then that meant it became an absolute beast of a book, and it's 1,000 sections long.
All right.
Yeah. It's the longest one I've written to date. I used to say it's the longest one I'm ever going to write, but I've now got an idea for a 2,000 section one, so I can't say that anymore.
Wow, yeah. I mean, and so for those different pathways in those when you're sort of doing it in that way, do you try and make it so those different routes are roughly the same sort of length? You're going to have a roughly the same number of sections for each of those versions of the story?
I mean, some of the ones I've written more recently, of my own, where you can choose which character at the start of the book, yes. So again, Dracula, you can play as Mina Murray, Jonathan Harker, Dr. Seward, or Count Dracula. Count Dracula's adventure is probably the shortest, but it still takes up 200 sections of the book. The other characters you can follow their paths, and you can change which character you are during the book, which is the first time I did that. But generally, it's certainly at the start. And if anybody knows the novel Dracula, it's epistolary in style. So you read their diaries or newspaper clippings or phonograph recordings of Dr. Seward. And Jonathan Harker, Mina, and Seward all experience elements of what Dracula's doing independently of each other. And it's only at the end that they all come together and experience the same thing. So I played up to that in the game book. And each of those paths to begin with before you join up are roughly the same length. Yes. So it's more satisfying. But I will do in games mini quests and things, which might mean that it's not completely balanced and it's up to the character what they do. Obviously, the mini quest, if you've got more sections to negotiate, there's more risk involved, but then there's also additional rewards. So it's balancing up the two.
And those Ace game books, this is your series of books where you have tackled classic fiction like Dracula and sort of taken a look at different stories, Alice in Wonderland, I think, as well, and sort of turned them into game books. I mean, that sounds like that would be an incredible amount of work to do that conversion. I mean, how does that work?
Well, yes. Lots of my projects have started off as, I could do that. And then I come to do it, I think, oh, actually, there's a lot more involved in this than I thought there was. With Alice, I'd written a Pax Britannia novella called White Rabbit, which was effectively a virtual reality story set in the Pax Britannia steampunk world. And it's all with the main character wakes up in a sanatorium and he sees the White Rabbit and he escapes, and it gets weirder and weirder. And because I had read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in the past, I'm trying to think at that point, because I did also read it with a class when I was teaching. No, I think that came after. But having first explored it in White Rabbit, I thought this would be quite fun to do as a game book, because part of it is Alice, she arrives in the corridor at the bottom of the well, and there's the whole business with her changing size and eating the cake and drinking the potion and trying to get through a door, and she's too big, or she's forgotten the key and she's too small. And I thought, what if you could do that in any order you wanted? And that was where it started from. But then, so it started off that the adaptation is effectively just a game book retelling of Alice's adventures. But then as it starts to branch, it becomes something quite different. And I had the idea that it's actually Alice's return to Wonderland. But as with many dreams, she's forgotten the first dream. So she doesn't remember she's been there before, but the other characters realize she has. And gradually you piece it together. And it's not the same story, but it's things have moved on in Wonderland. And it then involves elements of Through the Looking Glass as well. So it became, and also not just that, using other Carol puzzles, and he wrote a story called Phantasmagoria, and that gets mentioned in there as well. So yeah, playing all of those things to tell a game book. And it was quite different because also at the time I wasn't confident enough to say you are Alice. I thought people aren't going to want that. You are an 11-year-old girl, as also some people might not be happy with that. So you make the decisions for Alice, but she still has the adventure. But then having done it once, I felt more confident. So at the next one, I did The Wicked Wizard of Oz. And in that, you can play different characters, including Dorothy Gale. But in that, you are Dorothy if you choose to play as her. But equally, you can be the Lion, or you can be Tin Woodman. And I did that one because Alice went down really well. And I think it was one of those, it was lightning in the bottle. I think I was quite lucky because I decided to do it because it was the 150th anniversary of the publication of the original book. And I thought, I can tie it into this quite nicely. It wasn't going to be a series at the time. It was just, I'm going to do an Alice game book and we'll crowdfund it through Kickstarter and see what happens. But people liked it because, as I've discovered since, everyone all over the world knows Alice in Wonderland. So currently there's about 10 different editions of Alice around the world, including Japanese, Bulgarian, Spanish recently came out, Italian, French, German, Czech. Hungarian is coming out. There's one in Argentina. Yeah, so I think I've already missed some off there as well. At one point, a Russian publisher was interested, but they've gone quiet, funnily enough. So yeah, having done Alice, people said, you're going to do Through the Looking Glass for the next one. It's like, well, if you read the first, and you'll know that I did all of Alice. I've done Alice. I don't need to do any more. Oh, The Hunting of the Snarks in there as well. So I thought, well, how else could I carry this on? And I've never read it, but you know, Lost Girls, the graphic novel by Alan Moore and, oh, is it Melinda Gebbie? Is that her name?
I'm not. No, I don't
His
think
partner. So it's quite a saucy graphic novel. And it's the three women from the three stories. So it's Alice Liddell, Dorothy Gale, and Wendy Darling, all talking about their experience, their how should we put it, their coming of age experiences and how these got turned into these other stories. So I didn't go that route, but I thought, well, that's kind of a quasi trilogy. I know they're not written by the same author, but they kind of all fit together in my mind anyway. So I then did a game book adaptation of The Wicked Wizard of Oz. Sorry, The Wizard of Oz. I called it The Wicked Wizard of Oz. And again, it's Dorothy goes back to Oz. She meets up with her old friends. And there are, even though it's a sequel, there are elements in the story which people expect, you know, because if you are saying, well, this is based on The Wizard of Oz, you've then got to have the wizard, the Wicked Witch, other characters that people might know from the stories, you know, Munchkins, all this sort of business. So it's quite fun then, how can I give this my own twist? And having Alice was a little bit steampunk because I was still coming off my having written 8 steampunk novels. That was in there, creeping into whatever I wrote. But Wicked Wizard of Oz is more diesel punk, and the aesthetic, don't think it really comes through in the artwork, but it was meant to be kind of Art Deco and sort of industrialization a bit more. So certainly in the story, it does, I hope. And then so in that one, like I say, you can play as Dorothy, the Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow. But then while I was writing it, I thought, I'm never going to write this book again. It would be cool if you could be the Wicked Witch of the West. So I wrote her story in it. And then I thought, what about the wizard? So you can actually play as 6 different characters in that book. But again, that meant it got rather long. Right. That was 800, I think, or 850 sections. And I thought, that's huge. I'll never beat that. And then with the very next book, Neverland, that was 900 sections. And you can only play as 4 different characters. And that's not true. You can play as the crocodile, but it's a very short adventure. So yeah. So next was Peter Pan, I read The Wizard of Oz with a class I was teaching, and I'd never read it before. And I thought, I know the story of The Wizard of Oz. And the bit with the witch only comes about halfway through, and it's about a chapter or 2. There's so much more in the book, and so much more that Dorothy sees and places she visits. And then there's a whole series of Oz books that Baum wrote himself and other people have carried on. So I drew elements of the Baum books into that. And I was quite impressed with the book, because what I hadn't realized until I read it is all those characters, you know, the fact that the Tin Woodman wants a heart, the Scarecrow wants his brain. The Scarecrow is really clever, and the Tin Woodman is really compassionate, and the Lion is actually really brave. You know, and they fight, they kill all sorts of things. I think Tin Woodman kills like a flock of crows with his axe at one point, or heads got chopped off. So I was far more impressed than I thought it would be. But Peter Pan, I still felt was quite twee. And although it says Captain Hook says he does some gruesome things, there's elements of the story I wasn't completely comfortable with. For example, all the Native American Indians, not that they ever called that in the original. And I thought, how can I make this something that I want to write? In other words, something I would want to read. So I thought, what if Neverland was Skull Island from King Kong? So it's Peter Pan with dinosaurs. And that was a lot of fun to write because of that. So it ends up that Peter's a cyborg, which is why he never gets any older. Wendy Darling is a survivor of the Titanic. She gets washed up on the island. Tiger Lily is one of the best characters. She's the only one that can fight dinosaurs right from the start. Because I thought in the original, she gets really short shrift. She is just your typical damsel in distress who everybody falls in love with and has to be saved. But she's this a native of the island, and they're not the Piccaninny tribe. They're the Akala from the Lost World. So I had, Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World meets J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, and her story starts off that she's going through her rites of passage hunt, and she rides her saber-toothed tiger called Fang. And then you can also play as Captain Hook, and that was fun to write. And one of the things that I think in Peter Pan, if it was written now, would be different, is you hear the story of how Peter chopped off Captain Hook's hand. well, if that was such an important part of the story and why Hook is so driven to kill and destroy Peter, you would put that in the story these days. So that happens in the game book before you get onto any of the rest of it. So that was a lot of fun to write. I would really like to write a role-playing game that kind of expands the world of Neverland for that. But yeah, I indulged myself because I painted a map for the book as well of Neverland, various places on it. And there is a King Kong section in it. There's also a slightly Cthulhu-esque Deep Ones element to the story, as well as the dinosaurs. And Kev Crossley did the artwork, put lots of feathers on the dinosaurs. So that was quite cool as well, keeping up to date with modern trends. Yeah, so then that kind of completed the Quasi trilogy. And then it's like, well, how do I carry this on? And before I even wrote the Alice book, I'd actually wanted to turn Beowulf into a game book. And my idea was to make all the creatures in Beowulf some sort of Cthulhu mythos creature. So I think Grendel was going to be a deep one. His mum was going to be kind of Mother Hydra. The Loigor were going to be the dragon. But before I ever got around to writing it, I went back to teaching full time. And it just went on the back burner. And when I did do it, I based it far more just on the original myth and the other sagas. And I think, although the other version would have been fun, I think it's all the better for it. And having done that, I did so that was one which is slightly more linear. And it's, if you know the story of Beowulf, you pretty much know what's going to happen in the book. There are still places you can make choices, and there's a way that you can beat the ending of the original epic poem, but it's written in an intentionally epic style. But then for the next one, I did a game book based very loosely on Clement Clark Moore's A Visit from St. Nicholas. So 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. And that's 'Twas the Krampus Night Before Christmas, which makes much of the Krampus myth and other legends linked to Christmas, and was a lot of fun. That's a much more original story. But then having done so many, and I've also tackled Dracula, of course, but having done so many Western things, I wanted to expand beyond that, which is why the most recent one I've written is Ronin 47. Right. And I thought I'd love to do a retelling of the legend of the 47 Ronin. But whenever I sat down to plan it and make it fantastical, it just ended up sounding like the Keanu Reeves movie. And I thought, I don't want to do that, because people will say that's what you copied. So how do I make this different? So I thought, well, I'll set it in the future instead. So it's giant mechs versus kaiju, because I also wanted to write a kaiju game book. So all of the kaiju are named after mythical creatures from Japanese mythology. And as are the war machines in there as well, various yokai. So that was a lot of fun to write. Yeah,
that was great. Yeah, and you as you got on there, Shakespeare versus Cthulhu. So that's a more recent.
Oh, you noticed?
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
my very subtle advertising. Yeah,
because that's was that has recently come out or is coming out?
No, it's not even written yet.
Okay.
No, I'm going to crowdfund it this year. I haven't specified when, because I've got various other projects to finish first. And I think that way madness lies, to quote a certain playwright. But about 8 years ago, I did crowdfund Shakespeare versus Cthulhu, the short story anthology.
Right.
So I didn't write any of the stories in it, but I came up with the idea, pitched it to the publisher Snowbooks, and then I contacted various writer chums saying, would you write me a story? So I was really chuffed. Adrian Tchaikovsky's in there, Graham McNeil's in there, James Lovegrove, I mean, all sorts of people. So I was really pleased with that. And also we did, because it was crowdfunded, commissioned artwork for it. So I got some of the fighting fantasy artists to do. And there's Malcolm Barter, who illustrated Forest of Doom. That's one of his pictures. I won't try and find more, because I'm guaranteed not to be able to find any now. So I'll look for them. But yeah, Tony Huff did one. Neil, I want to say Neil Roberts, who does the covers for the Horus Heresy books.
Right, I'm not sure actually.
He did one for me. So yeah, it was that was fun. And at the time, when I was promoting the short story anthology, I thought, I'm going to try this new Patreon thing, and I'm going to say, this will be a game that you can get through Patreon. So I broke it down into different acts, thinking whenever people back it, you'll effectively get a self-contained act, and the next bit will come, next bit will come. And in the end, I thought, because of the way I work, Patreon would just drive me insane, because I'd feel I owed these people a book, and yet I was now having to fit to the diktats of a monthly release, whatever it is. So I put it to one side, and I didn't do anything with it. And now that I'm on to the 8th Ace game book, I've made the absolute decision that will be the next one. Because the trouble is, I keep changing my mind about what I want to write next. I've got so many ideas plotted out already. probably about another 7 or 8 that I could pretty much sit down and go through my notes and start working on. But I thought, no, I'm going to do this one now. So what's interesting is I've actually got the version I planned out in 2016 is what I'm writing. I haven't really changed it. But yeah, so that I will write this year and crowdfund this year. And then after that, I'm not sure.
And whilst all of that's been going on, you also did return to Fighting Fantasy as well, didn't you? And continue to write more Fighting Fantasy books, because I think you've done 8 in total now. Is that right?
Yes, technically I've done 7 and I've co-written 1. So yeah,
Right.
I did the first 3 for Puffin. So that was Spellbreaker, Knights of Doom, and Curse of the Mummy, which is just a little bit too on the nose, I think, but people liked it. Then I wrote Blood Bones, which is my pirates and voodoo and undead zombies game book, which then wasn't published. So the story is outlined in my History of Fighting Fantasy game books, all the details, but effectively Puffin Books wanted to revamp the series. They were going to make them shorter. So it was commissioned at 300 sections. And I planned it for 400, but then it was never published. So when Steve Jackson said we'd like to publish this, it was a chance to bring it back to the 400. So I did add back some things I had to cut, and there's some new bits in there which weren't in the original version. And that was published by Wizard Books. And then Wizard were keen to do new titles. They'd already done Ian Livingstone's Eye of the Dragon, and they did others as well. But they got me to write some more. So I then went on and wrote, I have to get the right order now, Howl of the Werewolf, which was next, which was a lot of fun. And again, I wasn't sure if I'd ever get to write another one, so I threw everything at it. And it's 515 sections long, which is unusual for Fighting Fantasy. But I then did get to write another one, so I wrote Storm Slayer, which is fighting a weather mage, and that does have some steampunk bits in it too. And then I wrote Night of the Necromancer, which starts where the other game books end. So right at the beginning, you're murdered, and you come back as a ghost, and you have to solve your own murder. And while you're a ghost, you can't interact with the physical world in the same way. You can gain various ghostly powers depending on what you try. So you can fly, you can walk through walls, you can possess people, you can scare them. I think there's some others as well. But part of that is you can fight other undead and they can harm you, but you can't harm people. But if they've got magical spells or blessed weapons, they can harm you. And then it gets to the point where to complete the adventure, you do actually have to gain a physical body, and there's various ways you can do that. But that was, I really enjoyed writing that one. And again, I think that and Howl of the Werewolf are the 2 which people seem to think are my best Fighting Fantasy. Yeah, and then Wizard Books stopped publishing them after Ian Livingstone's 30th anniversary title, which was Blood of the Zombies. But Scholastic started reprinting them again in 2017, and Ian contributed new titles. They had guest authors like Charlie Higson and Rhianna Pratchett do new books. And then for the 40th anniversary last year, both Steve and Ian wrote a book. But Steve basically got me to give him a hand to finish things off. So he presented me with honestly, I printed out all the ideas he sent me. It was a stack of paper about that big. And we worked through that together to bring it to fruition. So yes, that was my most recent Fighting Fantasy credit, was co-writing that with Steve Jackson.
And you've become the sort of historian of Fighting Fantasy as well, haven't you? You mentioned the sort of the history books that you've written about the entire series. What sort of made you think or decide to approach it from that angle as well?
I think probably to get myself a writing gig to begin with was the first thing. I first approached Wizard Books. So in the lead up to the 30th anniversary, everyone was aware this was coming up. And I pitched all sorts of ideas to them, one of which was a trilogy of game books, a bit like the Sorcery epic. There's an event in the history which Mark Gascoigne made up, I think, called the War of the Wizards, which affected mainly Alancia and Cool, and less so the old world. But in Alancia, my book was going to be set there, and it was going to have, you could play different character types. And I think I was going to have a giant and a dragon you could play as well. But effectively I said no. So I then pitched a book called The Master of Firetop Mountain, which is a bit like Judge Death's Boyhood of a Super Fiend. You know, it's Zagor the Warlock, the early years, and it's how he comes to become the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. And again, they said no. And I said, well, how about a history of Fighting Fantasy game books? You could do it like a coffee table book. And they said, great idea, but your ideas are becoming more expensive all the time. It's far too niche a product. It would cost far too much money. No. So I thought, well, maybe there is something in this history idea. And I've written fighting fantasy game books. I've read them since the start. I know lots about them. So I pitched the idea to SFX magazine, and they commissioned it. And I think it was originally commissioned at 2,000 words. And I said, I think I need 3,000. And when I submitted it, it was about either 7 or 8,000 words long. And I wrote to them saying that I know this is really unprofessional. This is far too long, but just have a look and see what you think. If you don't want it, I will cut it down. And they published the whole lot. And part of that was that I wrote a chronology. A bulk of the article was a chronology of the history of fighting fantasy, obviously done by year. And you could turn backwards and forwards or read. You could either read it straight through, or you could jump backwards and forwards to the different years to read other bits. And having written it, I thought, I know nothing about fighting fantasy. There is so much more that I have no idea about. I've only scratched the surface. So I thought, I really want to write this book. And it was then that Christian Dunn said to me, have you thought about Kickstarter? It's coming to the UK this winter or this autumn. And before I could launch You Are the Hero on Kickstarter, Sean Riley, the filmmaker, tried to crowdfund Turn to 400, the fighting fantasy documentary. Mm-hmm. I think he had a target of about £40,000, but unfortunately didn't hit it, but did raise 15,000. But Kickstarter being all or nothing, he didn't get any of the money. But I thought, there's £15,000 of Kickstarter funder or crowdfunder money out there if I can tap into this. And so I launched it on Kickstarter in December, and it funded in January, which is, I think Christmas isn't the best time to do a Kickstarter, but it worked, I'm pleased to say. Then I wrote the book, but although I was at that point, I'm now trying to think, no, I was teaching as well as writing, so I had that weird balance. I was rather foolish in that I did start, here's my next project. And people who backed You Are the Hero saying, well, hang on, are you writing our book or not? And it's like, well, yes, I am, but I also need to sort of, I think that I wasn't teaching at that point. So I'm a jobbing writer, I've got other things to launch, but I did learn a lesson then, which is partly why I'm not crowdfunding anything just yet till I finish other projects. I thought, fair enough. Having started writing it, I thought this will be about 30,000 words. It ended up being 100,000 because everybody I spoke to said, oh, you should talk to this person, or you should talk to this person. Because I interviewed Geraldine Cook, who was the commissioning editor who first contacted Stephen Ian about doing a book about role-playing games. I interviewed Philippa Dickinson, who was the editor on the first book, and at that point was running Random Transworld Publishing, and she was Terry Pratchett's editor. And I got put in touch with Barry Cunningham at Chicken House Books, who'd been involved, and all sorts of people. And it just grew in the telling. It got to the point where I thought, I've got to stop. And people were saying, oh no, this Kickstarter's late. And I think this was only early days in Kickstarter in the UK. So people were getting quite annoyed that it was a few months late. I think it ended up being 9 months late, which I think now for Kickstarters isn't bad, but I would never say that that's what you should do as the norm, because I'm very aware that the current edition is also late. You should aim to actually hit your deadlines, but I think people are more forgiving now. The nice thing was people liked the book. So when it came out, they were pleased. So they forgot that it had been late and they just remembered that they liked it. So I then, a few years later, it wasn't 5 years, but it was 5 years after the 30th anniversary, I thought, well, I've got enough material probably to write a second volume, because since the first one had been published, even more people had got in touch. So I'd managed to get hold of Keith Phillips, who wrote Siege of Sardath, and Jeff Senior, who'd illustrated Space Assassin. So they weren't in the first book. So they came in, and there was some fan stuff. And so I interviewed other people. And again, it grew. That became another 60,000 word book, I think, by that point. And then I did consciously think, well, the 40th anniversary, I should really do an update. But what I will do, I'll go back to the original article idea. I will have it as an interactive book. You can turn backwards and forwards, as well as reading it straight through. I will combine most of the material from parts 1 and 2 whilst cutting out some of the chaff, shall we say, but also meaning that people who bought the original 2, there was a point in them buying them, and add some new material for the last 5 years. And it's now 175,000 words long. It's halfway through layout because it's proving to be a real beast. We've got all sorts of logistical issues we've had to take into account, because if the book ends up being too heavy, it gets too expensive to post, and it's just been an adventure, shall we say. Yes.
It certainly sounds it, yeah. And then, is there anything else that you're working on at the moment then as well, alongside that?
Well, I've got I finished working on a book called Magic Realms: The Art of Fighting Fantasy. So that's something I've co-written with Syrian, and people who've got the original fight, You Are the Hero, will know that the artwork's quite a big part of that. But I have edited it partly with that in mind. So, but there's 20, I should know this, 24 or 5, maybe 26 chapters about individual artists, so particular artists. Every artist gets a mention. There's all sorts of artwork, covers, internal art, sketches. So it's going to be full color, and that's being published by Unbound. That should be out this autumn. I've just finished writing The Darkness Over Arkham, which is my Arkham horror game book. What else can I tell you about? I'm trying to think. I'll probably remember in a minute. But yeah, I guess Shakespeare versus Cthulhu is the next big thing that I'm planning to work on. There are some other things, irons in the fire, but I can't talk about those yet.
Sure.
Oh, and also we've got the Fighting Fantasy Fest 5 will happen this September as well. So I've got to organise that. But yeah, I can't believe it'll be 10 years of those actually, with the 10th anniversary of the first one of those.
Wow, that's great.
Which was only meant to be a book launch. You Are the Hero originally, in the telling as well.
But that's a great event where you bring together lots of people involved in Fighting Fantasy and fans of Fighting Fantasy, and it's just a celebration of the form, I guess, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. So the idea is people pay their ticket, they come in, and then everything's included, unless they want to do some shopping, of course. We don't charge for autographs or anything like that or photos, but there's always talks there have been in the past by Steve and Ian about the history of the books or their favourite games. We've had people like Ian McKay fly over from Canada one year. Obviously, sadly, we've lost Russ Nicholson and Chris Achilles in the last few years, but they both attended in the past. But yeah, writers, artists, but also beyond that now, we have foreign publishers we had the Japanese delegation last time. We've got people from Hungary coming over this time, people from Denmark who've done the Danish editions. We have Arian Games and Advanced Fighting Fantasy. We've had audio dramas. The people who write those and perform in those have appeared in the past. When there was Ian Livingstone's Fighting Fantasy, Freeway Fighter, the comic, published by Titan Comics, the creative team came along. Yeah, so we've had the people who wrote the Trolltooth Wars graphic novel, wrote and drew that. And we've also had live events like shows. So one of the features has become the auction, which is a lot of very entertaining, and people get some amazing say prizes. That's not the right word, is it? They don't win them, they pay for them. But yeah, like first edition White Dwarfs have gone, pristine first printings of the game books, kind of sort of point of sale things which you wouldn't normally be able to get hold of, and banners with I think one was for the 10th anniversary yearbook. But then we've also had things like John Robertson's The Dark Room, and he's done a live read through with Syrian of Death Trap Dungeon, which is always very entertaining. We're hoping to do some more of those this time. So yeah, it's kind of a whole day thing. People realize that they basically queue to get in. They don't want to miss anything because there's all sorts of talks. Last time we had Ian McCaig again, but a live video link from Canada to make that up. Yeah.
That's great.
So more of the same, hopefully.
Coming up in September, I think. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Well,
I know what else I can mention, and that's the Box of Delights, the role-playing game. Right. Another slightly delayed project of mine. But yes, that's the next, because I've written a couple of role-playing games, having written game books of works of literature. So the first I did was the Twas RPG, which is inspired by my game book, but the characters play as toys, and it sounds slightly twee, but when you read it, it's a little bit darker than that. It's a bit more like folk horror-y. And then last year I published my Herot RPG, which is based on Beowulf Beastslayer, and is basically Viking RPG, but also where storytelling is an important part of how you gain your hero points. It takes the idea, which is something which I used in the game book, is that jumping around here, I realize, but when you first meet Beowulf, or he first arrives at King Hrothgar's Hall, the reason people know he's a hero is because he tells them he is. He tells them about fighting sea monsters and things like that. So the idea is that you tell stories about your heroic deeds, and depending on how well you tell them, they become mini sort of side quests. You gain hero points. And the one thing I wish I'd done at the time, which I've done for the RPG, is they're now called weird points, which I thought was much more characterful. But it's the same thing. So part of the story is that it always starts with a group of people telling about their past adventures, and then that gives them here weird points, which means that in the actual game they can perform superheroic feats. Because obviously Grendel in Beowulf kills about sort of 12 or 20 warriors in one go without thinking about it, and yet Beowulf can wrestle in one-on-one. Why is that? It's because he is literally a hero, some kind of demigod with superpowers. So yeah, so I'm doing a game book that kind of, sorry, game book, an RPG that uses elements of both the rule sets, but it's John Macefield's A Box of Delights. So I got the license from the estate of John Macefield. So it will be familiar to anybody who's seen the TV series, but it's sticks much more closely to the book with some new elements to it. So that'll be out in time for Christmas.
Great. Yeah. I mean, just on the topic of RPGs, I guess that's a different sort of school of thought and process again from writing fiction and writing game books. Is there anything? Yeah.
Well, with the game books, although it might, you give people lots of choice, you can't give every option possible. Whereas in an RPG, in theory, that is open to you. So it's giving the games master the tools of how these might work out, how the outcome, what might result. So yes, it's slightly more open, and I write in quite a conversational style to the games master, which is a similar style to how I write my histories, as if I'm just chatting to a friend down the pub. So yeah, saying here are the tools, here are the characters, here's their stats, here's the setting, here's what you could do, here's what might happen, here's what to do if things go off the rails. Yeah.
Great. So, I mean, it sounds like many, many exciting projects on the way, and lots of fun stuff to be looking out for.
Hopefully. Hope so.
Great stuff, John. Well, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to me about your experiences in the worlds of all of these different amazing IPs and sort of different ways of writing and all that sort of stuff. So it's been fantastic. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Massive thank you to Jonathan Green for taking the time to talk to me about his experiences working on Fighting Fantasy, at the Black Library, and in the gamebook industry as a whole as it's changed over time. They were fascinating stories and I really, really enjoyed it. If you want to find out more about Jonathan's work, there is a link to his website in the description below. And you will also find out links to my Discord, to my Patreon, and to my Ko-fi if you want to help me out and support the channel. And you can also support the channel by using my affiliate links for Element Games. Those are in the description below as well. Thank you once again to Jonathan. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.